Hi everyone, in this video we're going to talk about source control, as well as a related topic, the CI/CD pipeline. That is how to deploy your code that you've written and turn it into an actual application that your users can use, CI/CD. So if you don't know what those are, that's okay, that's what this video is for. Stay tuned, let's get started. All right, so what is source control? At the most basic level, source control is a place to store your code. That's it. But you may be thinking, well, hold on. I could store my code on Google Drive or on my NAS or somewhere else, right? Well, you could, but could you version it there? Could multiple users, multiple developers work on the same project at the same time? I would wager not. That is why source control was invented. That's why it exists. It allows multiple users to work on the same code base at the same time. It gives you version control, so you can always roll back if necessary. And I want to kind of illustrate this using a scenario which I've prepared here. So let's just say you want to store your code on Google Drive, right? So you have user A that grabs the code base off of Google Drive. And then maybe a day later, user B comes in, grabs the code base from Google Drive. Since user A started first, let's just assume for the sake of this scenario that user A finished first. So they withdraw the code right here, and then they check it in right here. Well, they checked in their code, right? They finished working. And then user B checked in their code after, because they finished after, right? So this code base, this red code base, overwrote this green code base. So now your final code base is just whatever the last user submitted, because that's all you can do with Google Drive. Now, if you have source control, let's go through the same scenario. Again, user A checks out the code, user B checks out the code. Now, in this scenario, user A still finishes first, but their code is just a tiny slice of the entire code base. So they don't like copy over the entire code base. All they do is they copy over just a little bit of code that they've written. They insert it in here, and then user B finished their work, and then they put it in some other part of the code base, right? In this scenario, both user A and user B can work in tandem on the same code base. Now, of course, there are exceptions where user A and user B are working on the same code, and then you get things like merge conflicts. But generally, user A and user B will chat, maybe set up a screen share, and then they will resolve the merge conflicts. But this is rare. It usually doesn't happen because you don't usually have developers working on the same code, usually. But it does happen. In any case, in this first scenario, obviously not optimal, especially if you have more than one developer. This is where you want to be, this second scenario. That is source control. Pretty simple, right? Now, of course, there are more capabilities that source control has. The most popular way to store your code, Git, has a lot more things that you can do, right? So merges, and you can pull your code, you can merge your code, you can rebase your code, you can do all kinds of things with it. But the gist of it is it's a place to store your code. It's a place to version your code. I don't have a scenario for that here, but versioning, just assume you've released some feature and it's buggy and you got to roll back to the previous version. Could you do that with Google Drive? No, you could. I mean, you could copy a folder of a previous implementation. I guess you could, but it's hard. You gotta keep multiple copies. Whereas with Git, simple. You have a commit hash. You just roll back to that commit, and you're golden. You're good to go. So lots you can achieve with source control. Now, let's say you have your code stored in source control, and you're like, all right, I want to build my application, and I want my users to start using it. What are you going to do next? Well, that is where the CI/CD pipeline comes in. So I have 5 steps here. I should say 4 steps. Step 0 here is just a trigger. So you have a developer who just finished writing the code. They check in, meaning they commit their code, and then they push it up to Git. Git being the source control of choice for most people. This trigger kicks off a process. It's called a pipeline, a build pipeline. Because it's like, comes in one end, leaves the other. Your code comes in, it's just code, comes out as a built binary, and then gets deployed to a cloud provider. That's why it's a pipeline. First thing you're going to do is you're going to do a dev build and then test your code. We talked about testing in the previous video, so you can check that out if you want. But this build, this test, dev build and test step right here, very important. You must have this. You must have this step in your build pipeline. Now, if you're just a solid developer, and again, I talked about this in that testing video. If you're just a solid developer and you don't have any tests, okay, maybe you don't need step 1. But the moment you have tests, you're gonna need to do it step 1, dev build and test. Okay, let's just say all the tests have passed, because if not, you kind of can't go any further. There's a stop right here. If your tests have failed, you do not proceed. Thou shalt not pass. Then you go to step 2, assuming everything went fine. Now, in step 2, you're not building a dev build anymore. Now you're doing a production build. That build makes your code lean and fast, optimizes everything, and it makes your application as good as it can be. Builds the binaries, and you have the binaries ready to deploy. Deploy where? Well, in step 3, the continuous deployment section now, we are deploying our code. That is, uploading it somewhere. Now, this could be, for example, Railway, and I have some videos on that on the channel. It could be elsewhere. It could be Vercel. It could be Cloudflare. It could be Azure or AWS. But you're deploying your code. You're pushing your code somewhere. Your binary that you've built from your code. You're pushing that somewhere. And then you're also configuring it. So maybe you need some environment variables or so. That's part of the deployment after your code is built. But it doesn't end there. The last step of this, after you deploy, is monitoring. Now, you need to do this at least for a short period of time. You can't, there's this meme where you deploy on Friday at 4 p.m. and then go to happy hour, right? Like, that's gonna end poorly, because if you deployed something and then it doesn't work, and that does happen, even though you've run your tests, it still does happen. Let's say you've deployed something and it's hosed. Now your customers, sure, it's a Friday, so maybe your customers are, going home as well, but maybe they're not. Maybe they want to work on weekend. Now they can't because your app is down. So you want to stay and you want to monitor user activity just to make sure that you're not getting any exceptions, make sure no services are going down or you're running out of memory or anything like that. So stay around and monitor for a little while. You can also set alerts. For example, your infrastructure could have alerts for things like out of memory or unusual CPU cycles being used, stuff like that. But generally, you want to stay and watch for a little bit of time before you head out to happy hour. So that's monitoring. So this is the build pipeline. The continuous integration meaning building the code and running the tests, and then deployment, meaning, well, deploying and configuring and monitoring. So the build pipeline. Now, as usual, we'll take a look at some providers. So GitHub is something you might have heard. Might have heard of it, GitHub. You can do both. You can store your code, meaning source control, and you can deploy your code with actions, GitHub Actions. They're not perfect. Trust me. I use them right now. We use Actions right now. And I use GitHub. I've been using GitHub forever. Not a perfect experience, but it's not bad. And if you're just starting out, it gets you where you need to go. And they do have a free tier. Actually, most of these have a free tier where you're paying for build minutes or you're paying for transfer bandwidth. Usually it's build minutes at least. So GitHub, you can store code for free. And the actions, they give you, I think, like 15 minutes or some 100 minutes or something like that. I don't remember exactly, but depending on how long it takes to build your code, you withdraw those minutes from that total, and it resets at the beginning of the month. So all of these providers, GitHub, AWS, Azure, they have kind of the same. GitLab and CircleCI also, they have the same kind of free tier where you have free build minutes. Now you'll notice here I put the name of the company that owns the product. GitHub used to be its own company until a few years ago. They were bought by Microsoft. But Microsoft actually also has Azure DevOps, which is like yet another build pipeline that you can use specific to Azure. So if you're hosting on Azure, that's what you're going to be. I mean, you don't have to use it, but you could if you're just hosting on Azure. And same with AWS code pipeline. Like if you're hosting in AWS, it does make sense to use that tool as well. It has really pretty good integration with AWS. There are other providers, so GitLab, CircleCI. These are third parties that also provide a way for you to first host your code on GitLab and then also deploy. I think CircleCI connects to a repository, so you need your own source control, but then you can use the interface to build, test, deploy your code. TeamCity by JetBrains, again, also I think it was bought, but that's like a little while ago. They were bought, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. But they have a free product. Also Jenkins, also free. But it's free in a sense that you can download the product and there's a license for TeamCity and you can self-host it. But there are limits on the license for TeamCity. And Jenkins actually is open source and it's entirely free. But in my experience, it is also the worst of the bunch. But it is free. So theoretically, you could host Jenkins in Railway, for example, on your own infrastructure. And you could run these builds, you could run the tests, and you could deploy the code from Jenkins. But again, there are better options out there, right? So I've color coded these. If I were you, if I were starting a new SaaS business today, I would start with GitHub and GitHub Actions. It's free. And the free tier is more than enough to cover your first few builds, especially early on, as you're not even hosting in the cloud yet. Maybe you're just building locally. You don't even care about Actions, right, until you start hosting somewhere. So then if you're hosting in AWS or Azure, you may consider these two here, Code Pipeline and Azure DevOps. But I would also urge you to look at some alternatives. GitLab, CircleCI, and TeamCity also have very good deployment experiences. They kind of GitLab, CircleCI, and TeamCity specialize in the continuous deployment part of things. So I would urge you to take a look at those two. And of course, take a look at the pricing. A lot of these have per seat pricing or enterprise pricing. So, but honestly, if you're just starting out, you're going to use the free tier and it's going to be enough. And if it starts being expensive, I mean, you can always go Jenkins. But GitHub Actions, I would just do GitHub Actions. Honestly, just do that. All right, so that is that for source control and CI/CD providers, continuous integration, continuous deployment, as well as the different scenarios I showed you earlier. All of these graphics will be available. All these charts will be available on the website, deployanddestroy.xyz. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.